When people thought of a lone woman on the Dakota plains, they thought of vulnerability. They pictured a farmhouse adrift in a sea of grass, a single column of smoke rising against a vast and indifferent sky. They thought of the wind, a constant predator, and the coming winter, a final siege. In the autumn of 1888, the people of Prairie Ridge thought of Anna Martell in precisely this way. She was 30 years old. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone 5 months, taken by a fever that had burned through him in less than a week, leaving behind only his half-finished work and a silence that filled their 47-acre homestead more completely than any storm. The neighbors were kind. They brought her casseroles she did not need and offered advice she did not want. They worried for her. They saw a woman with a small frame and quiet eyes, and they assumed she would fail. They assumed she would sell the land by spring, retreating to the comparative safety of the town or, better yet, back east to family she no longer had. They thought of fuel and food. They thought of frozen livestock and the crushing loneliness. Here is what they never thought about, the specific gravity of packed snow. They never thought about the insulating properties of earth. They never thought about the precise angle of a ventilation shaft designed to prevent downdrafts in a 70-mile-per-hour gale. They did not think about these things because they had forgotten how. For them, survival was a matter of brute force, more wood, more food, thicker walls. For Anna Martell, it was a matter of physics. And in the winter of 1888, when the sky fell and the world vanished under a mountain of white, the distinction would mean the difference between a grave and a doorway. The assumptions of her neighbors were not malicious. They were simply the product of a people who had come to believe the surface of the world was the only one that mattered. Anna's knowledge was an inheritance, passed down not in coin or acreage, but in quiet instruction and handwritten notes on brittle, brown paper. Her grandfather had been a boy in the Alps, in a village where winter was not a season but a sovereign power. He had learned that you did not fight the cold. You did not challenge the snow. You went underneath it. He had seen entire hamlets disappear for months, living in interconnected cellars and tunnels, emerging in the spring pale but alive. When he came to America, he brought this understanding with him. He saw the vast, open prairies of the Midwest and did not see emptiness, he saw depth. He saw a landscape that offered the same solution as his mountainous homeland, only inverted. You did not tunnel into the side of a hill, you tunneled down. He taught his son, Anna's father, how to read the land not for its fertility, but for its stability. He taught him how to gauge the water table with a hand auger, how to recognize the difference between topsoil, clay, and bedrock by the feel of a shovel. He taught him that a man's true wealth in a harsh climate was not the size of his barn, but the depth of his cellar. Anna's father, in turn, had taught her. He had been a quiet man, a watcher. While other fathers taught their sons to shoot and their daughters to sow, he had taught Anna to observe. He taught her that the wind has a grain, like wood, and that a properly placed shelter belt of trees could change its direction. He taught her that snow was not a blanket but a building material, a shield against the very cold it embodied. He'd walk with her after the first frost, pointing out the subtle depressions in the land where the cold pooled, showing her how the deer and the foxes found shelter on the leeward side of rises she could barely see. "They don't fight it, Anna," he would say, his voice low. "They use it." When Thomas had proposed, her father had taken him aside. He had not asked about his finances or his intentions. He had asked him if he knew how to build a root cellar that wouldn't freeze. Thomas, a good man from a gentle Ohio valley, had laughed. "A cellar's a cellar," he'd said, and Anna's father had just nodded, a veil of disappointment in his eyes. He had given his blessing, but he had also given Anna a small, leather-bound journal filled with his own father's drawings, cross-sections of subterranean rooms, designs for ventilation shafts, tables calculating food and water needs per person, per month. It was the family Bible, and its gospel was preparedness. In the first week of September, while her neighbors were still bringing in the last of the harvest, Anna began to dig. She chose a spot not out in the open, but inside the woodshed that stood between the small farmhouse and the barn. The location was strategic. It was concealed from view. It was protected from the initial onslaught of weather. And most importantly, it offered a structural anchor for the roof of the chamber she planned to build. She did not use Thomas's heavy, broad-bladed shovels. She used her father's tools, a narrow spade for slicing through the dense prairie sod, a post-hole digger for starting the excavation, and a small, sharp trowel for the detail work. The first layer was the hardest, a foot-thick mat of grass roots, woven together so tightly it was like trying to dig through canvas. She cut it into neat, 2-foot squares, stacking them carefully to one side. These would be the final layer of her new roof, a living camouflage. Beneath the sod, the soil was a rich, black loam, and the digging was easier. She worked in the half-light of dawn and dusk, her movements economical and precise. She was not a strong woman in the way men were strong, with power in their shoulders and backs. Her strength was in her endurance, in the steady, metronomic rhythm of her work. Dig, lift, turn, dump. The pile of earth grew in the corner of the woodshed, which she concealed with a stack of old burlap sacks. Each day, she would take a portion of the excavated dirt in a wheelbarrow and scatter it thinly in the tall grass behind the barn, a little at a time, so no suspicious mound would form. She was creating a hole in the world, and she had to dispose of the evidence of its creation. The plan, taken from her grandfather's journal, was for a room 10 feet wide by 12 feet long, with a ceiling just high enough for her to stand upright. The floor of the chamber would be 8 feet below the surface. This depth was not arbitrary. It was the frost line. It was the depth at which the Earth's own latent warmth held the temperature at a steady, survivable constant, regardless of the fury raging above. Her neighbors' root cellars were 4, maybe 5 feet deep. They were for storing potatoes, not people. They would freeze. Anna knew this as a simple fact, a law of the local universe. She was not complaining. She was calculating. After 3 weeks of steady labor, she had a rectangular pit, the walls straight and true. The air at the bottom was cool and smelled of damp earth and minerals. It was a good smell. It was the smell of safety. But 4 feet down, the easy digging had ended. Her spade, which had slid so smoothly through the loam, began to strike something hard with a dull thud. It was a thick stratum of dense, yellow clay, baked hard by 1,000 rainless summers. It was like trying to dig through stone. For 2 days, she made almost no progress, her wrists and back aching with the strain. Her shovel scraped uselessly against the surface, chipping off only small flakes. This was the first true test of her resolve. It would have been easy to stop, to decide that 4 feet was deep enough. It was, after all, as deep as anyone else's cellar. But her father's voice was clear in her memory. The last few feet are the ones that count, Anna. Anyone can dig a hole. The question is, are you digging a pantry or a tomb? She remembered him describing this exact problem. Clay is just stubborn water, he'd said. You have to remind it what it is. The next morning, she hauled for buckets of water from the well and poured them into the pit. The water pooled on the surface of the clay, refusing to sink in. She left it. For a full day and night, she let the water sit, patiently coaxing the moisture back into the stubborn earth. When she returned the next day with a heavy iron pry bar, the clay had softened. It was still brutally hard work, but now, when she drove the bar into it, the clay gave way in thick, satisfying chunks. It took another week of this slow, arduous process, soaking, prying, and shoveling the heavy, sticky muck, but she broke through. Beneath the clay, the soil was softer again, a mix of sand and gravel that was easy to clear. As she worked, she thought about the trap door. It had to be perfect. Not just strong, but invisible. She used the thickest planks from the woodshed's floor, cutting them with a fine-toothed saw so the seams would be nearly undetectable. She engineered a hidden hinge mechanism on the underside and a recessed handle that lay flush with the wood. When the door was closed, it was just the floor. No outline, no shadow. Just the familiar dusty planks of the woodshed. This was the most critical part of the concealment. Her preparations were not for public discussion. They were hers alone, a covenant with her own survival. By the middle of October, the shelter was complete. The earthen walls were shored up with thick planks of cartonwood, braced against the pressure of the surrounding soil. She had built tiered shelves into one wall, loading them with the fruits of her late summer labor, jars of preserved beans, corn, and tomatoes, sacks of flour, sugar, and salt, tins of coffee, and several wheels of hard cheese sealed in wax. Along another wall, she stacked firewood for the small, efficient cast-iron stove she had installed in the corner. Its flue was a clever design from her grandfather's book, a narrow pipe that ran horizontally for several feet before angling up through the woodshed's roof, disguised as a simple ventilation pipe for the shed itself. This prevented the telltale column of smoke from rising directly above her hidden location. She ran a second, smaller pipe for fresh air intake, its opening concealed beneath a woodpile outside. A third wall was for water, 6 large barrels, filled and sealed. The final wall was for life. She had built a low, sturdy bench that could serve as a bed, and beneath it, storage for blankets, lamps, and a formidable supply of oil. She had even dug a narrow, wood-lined tunnel, just large enough for a person to crawl through, that connected the shelter directly to the small, enclosed chicken coop and the pig's pen inside the barn. She would not have to go outside for eggs, or to feed the animals. She had brought the farm, or the essential parts of it, underground with her. On the first day of November, the first test came. The sky turned the color of lead, the wind fell silent, and a strange, electric stillness settled over the plains. It was a prairie clipper, a fast-moving blizzard that struck with the force of a physical blow. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour. Within 2 hours, the world outside was a roaring chaos of wind and impenetrable snow. Her neighbors scrambled to secure their livestock and check their woodpiles. Anna simply closed the barn door, latched the woodshed, and lowered herself through the trap door. Down in her shelter, the world was transformed. The roar of the wind was a distant hum. The air was still and cool, but not cold. She lit a single oil lamp, its flame burning straight and tall, not a flicker. She cooked a small meal on the stove, the warmth spreading through the small space. She checked on her animals through the tunnel. The pig was asleep in its hay. The chickens were roosting, undisturbed. They ate. They slept. They were warm. The storm raged for 2 days. When it passed, she emerged into a world remade in white, the sun dazzling on the sculpted drifts. Her farm was untouched. Mr. Henderson, from the next property over, lost a dozen chickens when the roof of their coop partially collapsed. Mrs. Gable's porch railing was torn away by the wind. They had survived, but they were diminished. They were colder, more tired, and had fewer resources than before. Anna had simply waited. The neighbors noticed her good fortune, but they drew all the wrong conclusions. When Mr. Henderson rode over to check on her, he surveyed her tidy, undamaged farmstead with a mixture of relief and surprise. "Well, Anna," he said, his breath pluming in the frigid air, "looks like Thomas built this place to last. That's a good, solid barn you've got there." He was trying to be kind, to give credit to her late husband for her current security. He could not imagine that she, a woman alone, had done anything to contribute to it beyond simply existing within the sturdy structures a man had built. Anna just nodded. "He was a good builder," she said, the words tasting like ash. It was true, Thomas had been a competent carpenter, but the barn's strength had nothing to do with why her chickens were alive. They were alive because they had not been in the barn. They had been in a fortified pen, connected to a subterranean heat source. Mrs. Gable, when she saw Anna in town for supplies a week later, was more direct. "You were lucky the windbreak took the worst of it," she declared, referring to the row of scraggly poplars Thomas had planted. "Pure luck. The Lord was smiling on you, child." Anna bought more lamp oil. She bought 2 more sacks of flour and a 50-pound barrel of salted pork. Mrs. Gable watched her load the wagon. "Stocking up for a long winter, are we?" she asked, a note of gentle mockery in her voice. "You've got more stores there than a family of 6. Anna looked at the woman's thin shawl and the tired lines around her eyes. She saw a person who believed in luck because the alternative, that survival was a skill one could learn, was too terrifying a prospect. If it was a skill, then their own lack of it was their own fault. It was easier to believe in a fickle God than in a predictable catastrophe. So Anna said nothing. She let them believe in her luck. She let them praise her dead husband's foresight. Their misunderstanding was a form of insulation, as vital as the 8 feet of earth above her head. It kept them from asking questions. It kept them from discovering the trapdoor in the woodshed floor. She knew the clipper had been a warning shot. The real winter hadn't begun. While the rest of Prairie Ridge repaired their minor damage and settled into the false comfort of a mid-November thaw, Anna worked with a renewed and quiet urgency. The first storm had not been a victory, it had been a diagnostic test. It had revealed the strengths of her system, but also its potential weaknesses. The short tunnel to the barn had been a success, but she realized it was too narrow. In a true, prolonged blizzard, it could become blocked by a snowdrift if any part of the barn's structure failed. So, during the strange, warm days of what the old-timers called Fool's Spring, she widened it, shoring up the walls with more planking and deepening the entrance on the barn side, creating a small, sunken antechamber that would be impervious to drifting snow. She also considered the problem of time. The clipper had lasted 2 days. Her grandfather's journal spoke of storms in the old country that had buried villages for 2 months. She recalculated her supplies. She had enough food and water for 1 person for 90 days. But the storm would not care that she was 1 person. It would not politely leave after a certain allotment of time. She needed more. She made a discreet trip into town, not to the general store where Mrs. Gable would watch and comment, but to a smaller supplier on the edge of the settlement, a man who cared more about cash than about gossip. She bought another 100 pounds of flour, another 50 of beans, and, most critically, 3 more large tins of kerosene. This was her greatest extravagance, and her greatest fear. Food and water were useless if you froze in the dark. The final improvement was the most subtle. She spent a day meticulously sealing every tiny crack in the farmhouse above. She packed the window frames with rags and mud, sealed the door jambs with strips of leather, and insulated the attic with a thick layer of straw she hauled up, bucket by bucket. She knew she would not be living in the house, but she could not afford for it to be destroyed. A collapsed roof could block the woodshed, trapping her below. She was fortifying a structure she intended to abandon. It was a second level of planning that no one else would have even considered. They were thinking about the next storm. Anna was thinking about the one after that. She was no longer just following her father's instructions, she was extending them, adapting them to her specific circumstances. The knowledge was alive now, a part of her own thinking. She was ready. On the 23rd of December, 2 days before Christmas, the real storm began. It did not arrive with the dramatic fury of the clipper. It began with a gentle, almost apologetic snowfall. The flakes were large and wet, drifting down lazily in the windless air. It was beautiful. By evening, a soft blanket 6 inches deep covered the world. People in Prairie Ridge lit their lamps, stoked their fires, and spoke of a white Christmas. They were wrong. This was not a Christmas snow. It was a prelude. During the night, the temperature plummeted. The wind rose, not to a shriek, but to a low, monolithic moan that seemed to come from the core of the earth itself. It was a sound of immense and patient power. By morning, the world was gone. There was no sky, no horizon, no land. There was only a churning, horizontal torrent of white. It was not snowing in the conventional sense. The air itself had turned to snow, a dense, particulate blizzard that scoured the landscape. Anna was already below ground. She had felt the pressure drop the afternoon before, a familiar ache in her bones that her father had called the storm since she had made one last check of the farm, secured the animals, and descended into her sanctuary. The first 24 hours were a confirmation of her work. The wind's howl was a muted drone, the fury of the world held at bay by a few feet of dirt and wood. She established a routine. Wake. Light the lamp. Check the ventilation shafts for blockage, though their clever design made it unlikely. Eat a spare breakfast of hard bread and coffee. Feed the pig and chickens through the tunnel, collect the eggs. Read a chapter from one of the 3 books she had brought down, a Bible, a copy of Shakespeare, and her grandfather's journal. Measure the remaining supplies. Sleep. The routine was her defense against the madness of isolation. But as the first day turned into a third, and the third into a week, the true nature of the storm became apparent. This was not a blizzard. This was a geological event. The snow did not stop. The wind did not cease. It buried the world. Through her narrow ventilation pipe, she could hear the sound change. The deep moan of the wind was slowly muffled, replaced by an unnerving, absolute silence. The snow had risen above the pipe's opening. She had a secondary, taller shaft for this exact contingency, and when she opened its valve, the sound of the gale returned, fainter now, more distant. The snow was that deep. It had buried the woodshed. It was likely burying the house itself. She thought of her neighbors. She thought of Mr. Henderson and his family. Their house was well built, but it was on the surface. They had a fireplace, but their woodpile was outside, likely buried under 20 feet of snow. How long could they last? The silence from above was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a world being erased. After 12 days, the wind stopped. The silence that followed was profound, heavy, as if the air itself had become a solid thing. Anna waited a full day, listening. There were no sounds of melting, no dripping. The cold was absolute. She knew the storm wasn't over, it was pausing, gathering its strength for another assault. It was during this eerie calm that she heard it. A faint, rhythmic thumping. It wasn't coming from the wind. It was coming from above, from the direction of the house. Thump. Pause. Thump. It was the sound of someone digging. But they were digging from above. She held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound grew louder, more frantic. Then, a voice, muffled by snow and desperation. "Anna! Anna, are you in there?" It was Mr. Henderson. He had somehow found the roof of her house, a small peak jutting out from a mountain of snow, and was trying to dig down to a window or door. He sounded exhausted. Anna climbed the ladder and pushed against the trap door. It wouldn't budge. A thick layer of drifted snow inside the woodshed was blocking it. She took a deep breath, braced her shoulders against the wood, and heaved. The snow shifted with a groan, and the door opened a few inches. A sliver of pale, grey light cut through the darkness. "Mr. Henderson," she called out. The digging stopped. "Anna? My God, you're alive." His voice was choked with relief. "We saw your chimney pipe. It's the only one for a mile. We're in trouble, Anna. We're out of wood. The house is freezing." She pushed the door open the rest of the way. The woodshed was half filled with snow that had poured in through the eaves, but a narrow space remained. Beyond the shed's door, which was blocked, she could see the top of Mr. Henderson's head in the trench he had dug. His face was gaunt, his beard crusted with ice. "Can you get to the woodshed door?" she asked. It took him another 10 minutes of frantic digging, but he finally squeezed through. He stumbled into the relative dark of the shed, his eyes wide, struggling to understand. He saw the open trap door, the faint light from below. He saw her, alive and whole, not shivering, not starving. He just stared. "Come down," she said, her voice even. "Bring your families." It took 3 trips. He brought his wife, Sarah, and their 2 small children, their faces blue with cold, wrapped in every blanket they owned. They descended the ladder into the warm, still air of the shelter as if entering another world. Sarah started to weep, silent tears freezing on her cheeks. The children just stared at the glowing stove, their eyes wide. Mr. Henderson looked around the small, orderly room, at the shelves of food, the barrels of water, the neatly stacked firewood. He touched the planked wall, as if to confirm it was real. "How long have you had this?" he whispered, his voice full of awe. "My grandfather taught my father," Anna said simply. There was no triumph in her voice. "No, I told you so." There was only the quiet fact of the room around them. Later that day, the Gables arrived, having followed Henderson's tracks. And then the Wards. By the end of the pause, there were 11 people in Anna's shelter. She organized them. They ate in shifts. They slept in shifts. The children, recovering in the warmth, played quiet games on the floor. The adults spoke in hushed, reverent tones. They were living in a miracle, and its creator was the woman they had pitied. The Great Storm of 1888, the one they would later call the school children's blizzard for the hundreds it killed, raged for another week before finally breaking. When the survivors emerged from Anna's shelter, they stepped out into a landscape that was utterly alien. The world was a sculpture of white and blue, the familiar contours of their lives erased. Houses were buried to their eaves. Barns had vanished completely. The town of Prairie Ridge was gone, visible only as a series of mounds and the tops of a few chimneys. But they were alive. The story of Anna's Cellar, or Anna's Ark, as the children called it, became the defining legend of the storm. But it did not remain a legend for long. In the spring, when the great melt came and the devastating scale of the losses was clear, the community did not just mourn. They learned. Mr. Henderson, a man humbled and remade by the winter, became Anna's most fervent student. He did not ask her to build a shelter for him. He asked her to teach him how. That summer, the sound of digging was common on the plains. Men who had once mocked the idea of a cellar deeper than 5 feet now worked with a grim determination, following the principles laid out in the tattered pages of a journal written by a man who had died an ocean away. Anna did not hoard her knowledge. She gave it freely. She drew diagrams in the dirt, explained the physics of ventilation, and showed them how to read the land. The knowledge that had been a secret, a private inheritance, became public domain. It became the new common sense. Anna eventually remarried, a quiet homesteader who had lost his own family in the storm and understood the value of looking deeper than the surface. They had children, and she taught them the same lessons her father had taught her. But she taught them not as a warning against a skeptical world, but as a simple matter of fact, as one might teach a child to read or write. You went under the snow. You used the earth. You did not fight the winter, you respected it. Years later, long after Anna was gone, her original shelter remained. The woodshed was rebuilt, the farmhouse expanded, but the trap door in the floor was left untouched, a quiet monument. Grandchildren would sometimes open it and peer down into the cool, dark space, trying to imagine the world of white that had once raged above it. The shelter itself was no longer remarkable. Dozens of similar, better constructed versions now existed all across the territory. What was remarkable was that the knowledge had survived. It had passed from a grandfather in the Alps to a father on the plains, to a daughter who was underestimated by everyone. She had taken that knowledge, held it in secret, and used it to save the very people who had pitied her. She had not sought victory or vindication. She had simply prepared. And in the end, her quiet, methodical preparation had become a legacy, a living testament written not in stone or bronze, but in the simple, enduring architecture of survival. The candle flame that does not flicker.